Ever wonder what Jesus was really like? Beyond the stained glass and all the holiday specials. I mean, we hear about all the miracles in the sermons, but what about the man himself?
Right.
Like his life, his family, his personality.
It's a question that has fascinated people.
Yeah.
For centuries.
For sure.
And today we're going on a deep dive.
Yes, we are.
To uncover what we can about the historical Jesus.
Exactly. We're going to be like historical detectives.
Yeah.
Digging through the evidence. And we've got a lot of ground to cover today, but don't worry.
Right.
We're here to guide you through the most fascinating bits. Now, if you find yourself as intrigued by this topic as we are, head over to the ViralImpactAI channel.
Okay.
And check out the What Science is Hiding from You podcast.
All right.
For more thought-provoking deep dives like this one, hit that subscribe button.
Yeah.
And leave a comment letting us know your thoughts. We love hearing from you.
It's fascinating.
It is.
How a figure so central to Western civilization can also be so mysterious.
Right.
I mean, our main source of information about Jesus comes from the Gospels.
Right.
Which, as you know, were written decades after his death.
Yeah.
So right from the start, we're dealing with layers of interpretation and potential bias.
That's a great point. It's like trying to piece together a puzzle.
Yeah.
Where some of the pieces are missing and others might have been altered over time.
Exactly.
So how do historians even begin to separate fact from fiction when it comes to Jesus?
That's where the work of scholars like Antonio Piñero comes in.
Okay.
He's a renowned historian who uses a tool called the criterion of difficulty to assess the historical reliability of claims about Jesus.
Interesting.
Essentially, the idea is that if something in the Gospels would have been embarrassing or controversial for early Christians, it's more likely to be true.
That's a really intriguing approach. So it's like if the early Christians were willing to include details that might make Jesus look less than perfect, or that challenge their own evolving beliefs, those details are more likely to be grounded in actual events.
Exactly. For example, think about the scene where Jesus overturns the tables of the money changers in the temple.
Right.
It's a moment of anger and even violence. Not exactly the image of a peaceful Messiah that we're used to.
That's a powerful example.
Right.
You can almost imagine early Christians thinking, maybe we should just leave that part out.
Yeah, yeah.
But the fact that they didn't suggests that it must have been a pretty well-known event.
Exactly.
Perhaps too significant to ignore.
Too significant.
So through this lens of the criterion of difficulty, what can we say with reasonable certainty about Jesus' life?
Well, based on a combination of historical sources and scholarly analysis, we can say that Jesus was born sometime between 6 and 4 BCE, likely in Nazareth, though there's debate about whether his family might have originated in Bethlehem.
Oh, interesting.
He grew up in a working-class family.
Yeah.
His father was a carpenter.
Okay.
And while we don't have any physical descriptions of him, it's safe to assume he would have looked like a typical Jewish man of his time and place.
Right.
Yeah.
Okay, so we're starting to get a picture of Jesus as a real person.
Yeah.
Someone who lived and breathed in a specific time and place.
Exactly.
But what about his personality? What was he like?
The Gospels offer some tantalizing glimpses into Jesus's character.
Okay.
We see a man who was incredibly charismatic and compassionate.
Okay.
Someone who could draw crowds with his teachings and heal the sick.
Wow.
But he was also complex, capable of deep emotion, and even anger, as we saw in the temple incident.
And what about that moment in the Garden of Gethsemane where he's literally sweating blood in anguish before his arrest?
Yeah.
That doesn't sound like the serene, untouchable figure we often see depicted in Ark.
Exactly. That scene points to Jesus's very human fear and vulnerability.
Yeah.
He knew what was coming.
Right.
And he was terrified.
Wow.
It's a stark contrast
to
the more idealized portrait of Jesus in the Gospel of John, where he seems almost detached from his suffering.
Interesting. It's these glimpses of vulnerability that make Jesus feel relatable, even across the centuries.
Right.
It reminds us that he wasn't some distant deity. He was a human being who experienced the full range of human emotions. And speaking of relatable, I think our listeners would agree that this deep dive is already incredibly insightful.
Yeah.
If you're enjoying it, head over to the ViralImpactAI channel. And subscribe to the What Science is Hiding from You podcast for more deep dives like this.
Awesome.
Don't forget to leave a comment. And share your thoughts.
Definitely. Well, we love hearing from our listeners.
Now let's shift gears and talk about what really set Jesus apart.
Okay.
His message, his teachings, and the revolutionary ideas.
Right.
That would change the course of history. Welcome back to our deep dive into the historical Jesus.
All right.
We've been exploring the man behind the myth.
Yes.
But now it's time to delve into the heart of what made him so revolutionary.
Okay.
His message.
Right. We've got a sense of who Jesus was, where he came from, and what he was like.
Exactly.
Now let's talk about what he preached.
Right.
Because it's clear that his teachings had a profound impact on the people around him.
Absolutely.
So what were some of the core themes of his message?
Well, at the center of Jesus's teachings was the idea of the kingdom of God.
Okay.
A concept
Yeah.
deeply rooted in Jewish tradition.
Right.
But Jesus presented it in a way that felt both urgent and radical.
Okay.
He spoke about the kingdom as something that was about to break into the world. Wow.
Bringing with it a dramatic overturning of the existing social order.
So it wasn't just some abstract theological concept.
Right.
It was something that had real world implications, something that people could expect to see in their lifetimes.
Exactly. And that's why it resonated so deeply with people who were struggling under Roman occupation, who were longing for liberation and a more just society.
For sure.
But Jesus's vision of the kingdom of God wasn't just about political revolution. It was about a radical transformation of the human heart.
So it was about inner change as well as outer change.
Exactly.
What were some of the specific teachings that Jesus emphasized?
Well, he talked a lot about love, forgiveness, and compassion. He challenged traditional hierarchies and called for radical equality, even urging his followers to love their enemies.
Wow.
He emphasized the importance of humility and service, telling his disciples
that the greatest among them would be the one who served others.
These ideas are still incredibly relevant today.
Absolutely.
They challenge us to think about how we treat each other, how we relate to power, and what it means to live a life of purpose and meaning.
For sure.
It's no wonder that Jesus's teachings have had such a lasting impact.
And it's fascinating to see how those teachings were shaped by his own context.
Right.
Jesus was a Jewish man living in a specific time and place.
Right.
And his message was rooted in his understanding of Jewish scripture and tradition.
Okay, so he was very much a product of his time.
He was.
But at the same time, his teachings had a universal quality that transcended those specific roots they spoke to something deep within the human spirit.
Exactly.
Something that resonated with people across cultures and centuries.
Absolutely. And as we discussed earlier, it's important to remember that Jesus wasn't trying to start a new religion.
Right. He was operating within his own Jewish tradition, calling for reform and renewal.
Okay.
The transformation of his movement into the global religion we know as Christianity happened after his death as his followers spread his message.
Right.
And began to interpret it in new ways.
That's a really important point.
Yeah.
It challenges the traditional narrative that Jesus set out to create Christianity.
Yeah.
Instead, we see a more complex and nuanced picture of a man whose teachings sparked a movement that he may not have fully anticipated.
Exactly.
And speaking of complex and nuanced, we have to address some of the thornier questions about Jesus's life.
Yeah.
Questions that often lead to more speculation than historical certainty.
For sure.
Right, like the whole debate about his birthplace, which we touched on earlier.
Right.
We mentioned that he was most likely born in Nazareth, but some Gospels place his birth in Bethlehem, which was seen as the prophesied birthplace of the Messiah. Why does this discrepancy even matter?
Well, it highlights how even seemingly basic facts about Jesus's life became intertwined with theological interpretations.
Okay.
The Bethlehem narrative, which emphasizes Jesus's messianic identity, fit more neatly with the developing beliefs of early Christians.
Okay.
It became part of the story they were telling about who Jesus was and what his mission was.
It's a reminder that we're always looking at the past through the lens of the present.
Absolutely.
And our own biases and assumptions can color our understanding of history.
Exactly. And when it comes to Jesus, separating the historical figure from the layers of myth and interpretation can be quite a challenge, but that's part of what makes this deep dive so fascinating.
And speaking of fascinating, if you're enjoying this exploration of the historical Jesus, you won't want to miss out on other incredible deep dives on the ViralImpactAI channel and the What Science is Hiding from You podcast. Hit that subscribe button and leave a comment sharing your thoughts on this episode.
Now let's move on to another area where history gets a bit murky.
Okay.
Question of Jesus's family and relationships.
So we've been talking about Jesus's family and relationships.
Right.
And I think this is where things get a bit more, well, shall we say, speculative.
Yeah.
Because the Gospels don't give us a ton of detail about, Jesus' personal life.
Exactly. And some of the most enduring questions revolve around figures like Mary Magdalene, who's often been portrayed as Jesus's romantic partner.
Yeah, you see that in a lot of movies and books.
Exactly.
But what does the historical evidence actually tell us?
Well, the historical evidence is actually pretty scant.
Okay.
The Gospels mention Mary Magdalene as one of the women who followed Jesus and witnessed his crucifixion and resurrection, but there's no indication of any romantic relationship between them.
So that whole idea is basically a later invention.
Yeah, it seems to have developed over time, perhaps as a way to humanize Jesus.
Or maybe to add a bit of intrigue to the story.
Possibly.
But it's important to stick to the facts.
Absolutely. We have to be careful not to let our imaginations run wild.
Right.
And fill in the gaps with what we want to believe.
Instead of what the evidence actually suggests.
Exactly.
And I think that's a good lesson to keep in mind.
Yeah.
As we wrap up our deep dive into the historical Jesus. We've covered a lot of ground.
Yeah, a lot of fascinating material.
From his birth and upbringing in Nazareth. To the radical nature of his teachings and the evolution of his movement into the global faith we know as Christianity.
It's been quite a journey.
It has. And I think what's really struck me is the importance of separating the historical Jesus from the layers of myth and interpretation that have accumulated over the centuries.
Yeah, it's so easy to get caught up in the stories and the legends.
Yeah.
But it's crucial to remember that there was a real human being at the heart of it all.
A man who lived and breathed and challenged the status quo.
Exactly, and whose message continues to resonate with people all over the world.
And for listeners who are eager to explore more historical mysteries and delve deeper into the forces that shape our world, I highly recommend checking out the What Science is Hiding from You podcast and the ViralImpactAI channel.
Absolutely. Those are great resources for anyone who wants to keep learning and questioning and expanding their understanding of the past.
Exactly. And as we sign off, I want to leave you with a final thought to ponder. We've talked about how Jesus' message was so radical for its time, calling for love, forgiveness, compassion, social justice, ideas that were truly revolutionary in the context of the Roman Empire.
Yeah.
But here's the thing, those ideas are still radical today. They still challenge us to think differently about how we live our lives, how we treat each other, how we build a more just and compassionate world.
So the question I want to leave you with is this: what does it mean to be a follower of Jesus in the 21st century? How can we take those radical teachings and apply them to the challenges we face today?
That's a great question.
It's something for all of us to think about.
Yeah, it is. Thanks for joining us on this deep dive into the historical Jesus.
It's been a pleasure.
Yeah.